Information Morning, as you know, has been following the report by child and youth advocate Bernard Richard into the tragic death of Juliana. She's the 2-year-old girl who died of complications from a perforated bowel. Her mother was found guilty of criminal negligence and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Now, we interviewed Bernard Richard on Friday and talked about his report, and after that we heard from the Minister of Community and Social Services, Mary Scryer. After those interviews, we got an email from Reverend George Feenstra of the Nashwauk United Church. He is also with the Fredericton Community Planning Group. Reverend Feenstra sees firsthand the problem of child abuse and neglect. Here's part of what he said in his email. In New Brunswick, as in the rest of Canada, the poor are generally considered personally responsible for their predicament. In more than many cases, their poverty is considered as a sign of personal failure rooted in a lack of moral fiber. This is the case even though the preponderance of critical research indicates that poverty, with all the consequent health and social costs, is a manifestation of failed social policy. I am a minister in the Christian Church and a member of Fredericton's Community Planning Group. We are focused on the issues of vulnerability directly related to poverty. Consisting of persons representing a wide diversity of community agencies, our group's work is constantly frustrated and hindered by the lack of political will at the civic, provincial, and federal levels of accountability. As Mr. Richard suggested, those most directly involved in the person-to-person contact with the vulnerable poor do all that they can just to keep patches in place. Much benefit would accrue if these persons could have a more direct influence in the shaping of binding policy. My colleagues and I know well that baby Juliana's death could have been prevented. That prevention would have occurred had social circumstances been more conducive to helping her mother at the earliest stages of her own mental and physical neglect. Neglect that is systemic and statistically bound to result in tragedy. Hopefully, citizens here and everywhere will take notice. This may lead to the overhaul of attitudes and priorities permitting remedy that goes beyond hand-wringing and lip service. And that was an excerpt of an email sent to us by United Church Minister George Feenstra. And because of that email, we invited Reverend Feenstra into our studio for more discussion this morning. Welcome.
Good morning, Terry.
Nice to have you here. The line that stood out to me in your email was, our group's work is constantly frustrated and hindered by the lack of political will at the civic, provincial, and federal levels of accountability. Tell me more about that.
Well, I think I could begin by referencing Mr. Richard's report, where he notices that social workers and other such persons who are professionally involved with delivering relief and remedy to persons in extreme need, these persons often know the situation from the inside out. They end up, although they work at maintaining professional distance, they end up getting to know these people, and they begin to realize that it's not simply a dollar and cents problem. Now, as they try to communicate their concerns upwards through the chain of command, they get tied up with increasing layers of paperwork and such things, so that energy is diverted from the task, which is caring for the people most at risk, and the energy is then directed towards trying to placate funders and policymakers, trying to get them to see the light. And this becomes frustrating, and also it sets up a situation of competition between agencies, so that people are seeking funding, so they have to work against one another almost, even though they're working on the same root problems. They have to be in competition just to secure funding. So I suppose what we would be hoping for is a more open policy, a more cognizant of the needs and how do we address those needs. And that seems to be a hard sell, even though politicians from early stages in this particular kind of issue have been aware and have declared resolve to address it in meaningful ways.
But it's happening, but, you know, you're not saying just one level is responsible. You're saying it's at a civic, a provincial, and a federal level. How does that happen?
Well, for an example, if I'm with a community planning group and we have some issues or some strategies that we'd like to implement, we might take them to City Hall. I've personally been in conversation with Mayor Woodside early on in my time in Fredericton. His attitude at that time seemed to be that the city had no responsibility to these citizens of the local economy. That is to say, they were on their own. Now, he deferred that responsibility by suggesting that he would be much more willing to participate in our projects and such if the provincial government would come on board. But then, of course, if we move it up to the provincial government, then what they will say is, well, we are getting no support from the federal. So decision-making, responsibility-taking just keeps getting bumped up the ladder. And at the highest levels, of course, they are so far removed from the lived experience of babies like Juliana and her mom and the boyfriend and all such things that they have no way of making a good decision about the problem. If we could somehow get the information coming from the street level or the home level and get that to be the determining factor in the shaping of policy, we might see some hope. But right from local government, our city hall, there's sort of a fatalistic, the poor you have always had with you, speaking as a theologian. You've always had the poor there. Don't expect us to do anything about it.
But there's a belief that says politicians will change policy when they perceive the public cares enough for that policy to be changed.
I suspect that idea has some currency, or had some currency, maybe a decade ago, maybe 3 decades ago, or 5 decades ago. I suspect that politics now is pretty much a managed affair through advertising agencies and such things, and that what we are now concerned on is about the same thing that any NHL franchise team would be concerned with, winning the game. And it has become a game of sorts and has become a spectacle of sorts. But politics in many ways has become quite irrelevant to the lived experience of the most vulnerable. And if we are to take the state seriously, I think we should begin by assuming that the state has an obligation in the first place to address the needs of the most vulnerable. As a theologian, I would be in no position to say bring a legal case against the government, but as a theologian, I could certainly bring what we would call a prophetic lawsuit, in which the history of the Christian scriptures and other scriptures as well suggests that the state is bound and obligated to care, and wherever that care breaks down, the state is held accountable before divine authority.
You could make a breach of contract argument there.
Well, that would be the case. Yes, exactly.
I wish I had more time because I'm enjoying this conversation with you, and you're saying some important things. But the way this business works, I've got to move on.
May I have one last word?
Yes.
All I would say is that whoever you are listening today, wherever you get a chance to come alongside somebody who's in distress or in anguish, do what you can, even if it's a smile, even if it's a kind word, even if it's a generous deed. Do what you can. The government won't, and you may make the difference.
Pleasure meeting you.
Thanks, Terry.